Tonight, the temperature drops below freezing, and somewhere out there, a gardener is watching their fruit tree die, wrapping it in cloth, running extension cords for heat lamps, doing everything the industry told them to do, spending money they don't have on solutions that barely work. But 4 years ago, a farmer in the Canary Islands did something different. He didn't buy anything. He walked to the edge of his field, picked up a handful of dark river stones, and buried them around the base of his oldest olive tree. That tree survived 3 consecutive frost nights. The neighbor's trees did not. The stones cost him nothing. The knowledge, however, had been buried for nearly 2,000 years. What you're about to learn is not a gardening tip. It's not a hack or a shortcut. It's a thermal and hydrological system, engineered by ancient civilizations, validated by modern soil science, and completely ignored by a $130 billion gardening industry that has absolutely no interest in selling you a rock from a riverbed. No product, no packaging, no profit margin, just physics. So ask yourself, if this method works and the science says it does, why has no gardening channel, no nursery, no university extension program ever taught you this? Who decided that $4 of gravel was less valuable than a $200 frost protection kit? That question has an answer. And by the end of this video, you won't be able to look at a bag of river stones the same way again. 2,000 years ago, in the middle of one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth, a civilization was farming. Not surviving. Farming. Growing grapes, olives, wheat, and pistachios in a region that received less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year. For context, the Sahara Desert averages around 25 millimeters. The Negev, where these people lived, wasn't much better. And yet the Nabateans, a trading empire that controlled the incense routes between Arabia and the Mediterranean, figured out how to pull harvests from stone and sand that would kill any modern crop within weeks. Archaeologists who excavated their ancient farm terraces in the 1950s expected to find sophisticated irrigation canals, buried cisterns, some kind of elaborate water infrastructure. What they found instead stopped them cold. The fields were lined with loose rock. Not walls, not channels, just deliberate rows and clusters of dark, uncut stones placed directly on and into the soil around the base of plants. There was no obvious engineering, no grand architecture, just rocks. And at first, the scientists assumed it was coincidence, or perhaps primitive aesthetic choice. It was neither. When researchers from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem ran thermal analysis on reconstructed Nabatean plots in the 1990s, they discovered something that rewrote the understanding of ancient agriculture in arid zones. The stones were functioning as thermal batteries. During the day, dark-colored basalt and granite absorbed solar radiation and transferred that heat downward into the root zone, not upward into the air, but down into the soil where it mattered. At night, when desert temperatures collapsed by as much as 20 degrees Celsius within hours, those stones continued releasing stored heat into the ground around the roots. The soil temperature in a rock-covered Nabatean plot stayed 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, warmer than exposed soil through the coldest hours before dawn. 3 to 4 degrees. It doesn't sound like much. But in plant biology, 3 degrees is the difference between a living root system and a dead one. The Nabateans didn't have thermometers. They didn't have soil science journals or university extension programs. What they had was 2,000 years of observation, failure, and refinement. And the result was a system so effective that when modern researchers tried to replicate it in controlled trials, the reconstructed ancient plots outperformed contemporary frost cloth in sustained overnight protection. That knowledge existed. It was documented. It was studied. And then somehow it disappeared from every gardening manual ever written in the last century. The question is why? But before we get to that, the Nabateans weren't alone. On the other side of the world, at an elevation where the air is thin and the nights are brutal, another civilization was doing the same thing. The Inca Empire stretched across the Andes Mountains at altitudes between 3,000 and 4,500 meters above sea level. A landscape where frost can strike any month of the year, where the growing window is measured in weeks, not seasons, and where a single bad night can erase an entire harvest. The Inca fed 12 million people from that terrain, and they did it in part with stones. Archaeologists excavating agricultural terraces in the Sacred Valley of Peru found that the raised bed systems, known as waru-waru, were not just soil mounded into rows. The base layer of each bed was packed with dark volcanic rock. Same principle, different continent, different century. The rock absorbed heat during the high-altitude days when solar radiation is actually more intense than at sea level, then radiated it back upward through the night, creating a microclimate around the root zone that could be as much as 4 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding air. NASA researchers studying Andean agriculture in 2003 confirmed that reconstructed waru-waru plots reduced frost damage by up to 90% compared to unprotected soil in the same field. 90% with rocks and dirt. Then there is Lanzarote, a volcanic island off the coast of West Africa, part of the Canary Islands, where the annual rainfall is approximately 140 millimeters and the soil is essentially ash. In the 16th century, after a series of volcanic eruptions buried the island's farmland under meters of lava rock, the farmers of Lanzarote didn't abandon their land. They invented a technique called inarenado, which translates roughly as the sanding. They spread a layer of crushed, dark volcanic rock, called pecan, across the surface of their fields, 3 to 10 centimeters deep, and planted directly through it. The results were so improbable that outside observers initially refused to believe the harvests were real. The porous volcanic rock captured nighttime condensation and funneled moisture directly to the roots. It insulated the soil from temperature extremes. It suppressed evaporation almost entirely. Lanzarote became one of the most productive wine-producing regions in Europe, on a near-desert island, and the technique has been practiced continuously for over 400 years. In 1994, UNESCO designated the Lanzarote agricultural landscape a biosphere reserve, specifically citing the Inarenado system as an irreplaceable human achievement. 3 civilizations, 3 continents, thousands of years apart, all arriving at the same conclusion independently. Dark stone, placed deliberately around plant roots, changes what the soil can survive. That is not folklore. That is convergent engineering. And the science behind why it works is stranger and more powerful than any of them could have known. Here is a number worth sitting with: $130 billion. That is the current size of the global gardening products market. The fertilizers, the frost covers, the drip irrigation kits, the soil amendments, the heat cables you wrap around tree trunks every November. $130 billion built almost entirely on the premise that your garden cannot function without something you purchase. That number is projected to reach $170 billion by 2030. The people who own that number are not neutral parties in the conversation about what gardening knowledge gets amplified and what gets forgotten. Think about what a thermal rock pillar system requires. You dig a hole. You fill it with dark stones. You walk away. The stones come from a riverbed, a construction site, a landscaping surplus pile. There is no product to manufacture, no formula to patent, no subscription to sell, no reason for a single company in that $130 billion industry to ever mention it in a magazine, sponsor a video about it, or include it in a beginner gardening kit. The silence around this method is not accidental. It is structural. Knowledge that cannot be monetized does not get marketing budgets. It does not get shelf space. It does not get recommended by the algorithm. Compare that to what the industry does sell. Electric root zone heaters retail between $80 and $200 per tree per season. Frost protection fleece runs $15 to $40 per plant per year and degrades after 2 seasons. Subsurface drip irrigation systems start at $50 and require replacement parts. The $130 billion market needs you to believe that cold soil and dry roots are engineering problems requiring engineered products. Because the moment you understand that $4 of river gravel solves the same problem, permanently, a small but meaningful piece of that $170 billion projection disappears. Ancient farmers didn't have a choice. They couldn't buy their way out of a frost. They had to understand their land well enough to work with physics directly. That forced intimacy with natural systems produced knowledge so efficient it survived 2,000 years, and was then quietly shelved the moment there was money to be made, selling you something else instead. Now let's talk about what is actually happening inside the ground when you bury those stones, because the physics here is not metaphor. It is measurable, repeatable, and frankly, more elegant than anything you will find in a $60 bag of frost protection granules. Every material on Earth has a property called thermal mass, the ability to absorb heat energy and release it slowly over time. Water has high thermal mass, concrete has moderate thermal mass, dry loose soil has very low thermal mass, which is why bare ground loses heat so rapidly after sunset that the temperature at root level can drop 8 to 10 degrees Celsius within 2 hours of darkness. Your plant roots are sitting in a thermal environment that collapses the moment the sun disappears. That is the core vulnerability that frost exploits. Dark-colored igneous rock, basalt, granite, andesite, has a thermal mass roughly 3 to 4 times higher than dry topsoil. When you pack a column of that rock into a narrow hole beside your plant, you are installing a heat reservoir directly adjacent to the root zone. During the day, that column absorbs solar energy continuously. The dark surface color is not aesthetic, it is functional. A dark basalt surface absorbs approximately 90 to 95% of incoming solar radiation, compared to 60 to 70% for light-colored gravel. That difference in absorption accumulates over 6 to 8 hours of daylight into a significant thermal charge stored inside the column. Then night falls. The air temperature drops. Bare soil begins hemorrhaging its heat upward into the atmosphere within minutes. But the rock column releases its stored energy slowly, conductively, steadily, directly into the surrounding soil matrix. Soil temperature monitoring studies conducted at the University of Arizona in 2011 on rock mulch plots found that root zone temperatures in rock-covered soil averaged 3.2 degrees Celsius, warmer than uncovered control plots at 4 a.m., the coldest point of the night, which is precisely when frost damage is most severe. 3.2 degrees, measured, published, available in peer-reviewed literature for 14 years, and still absent from every mainstream gardening guide on the market. Now here is where honesty matters, and this channel will always give you the honest version before the optimistic one. Thermal rock pillars are not a frost-proof shield. If your overnight low is dropping to -10 or -12 degrees Celsius, no passive stone system will save a tender tropical plant. This method is most effective in the frost range of -1 to -5 degrees, the zone where the majority of fruit trees, perennial herbs, and established shrubs are actually vulnerable. Within that range, the 3 to 4 degree soil temperature buffer is often the precise margin between root survival and root death. Outside that range, you need additional protection, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. But here is what that limitation does not diminish. For the majority of temperate gardeners dealing with the majority of frost events in a typical winter, this method, costing under $10 per tree, is operating in exactly the temperature window where it matters most. And the thermal mechanism is only half the story. What happens to water inside that rock column at night changes everything again. There is a second mechanism inside those stones that most people never reach, because they stop at the thermal explanation and assume that is the whole story. It is not. In some climates, the water effect is actually more valuable than the heat effect, and it operates on a principle so counterintuitive that when you first hear it, it sounds like it cannot possibly be true. When warm, moisture-laden air meets a surface that is cooler than the dew point temperature, water vapor condenses out of the air and forms liquid droplets on that surface. You have seen this your entire life. On a cold glass on a humid evening, on the outside of a metal pipe in the morning, on grass blades covered in dew at dawn. It is not complicated physics. But what happens when that condensation surface is not exposed to open air, but buried inside a column of porous rock packed into the soil directly beside a root system? The rock column, having radiated much of its stored heat outward during the night, becomes cooler than the surrounding air by early morning, typically between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Humid air, which moves through soil pores constantly, comes into contact with the cooler rock surfaces inside the column. Condensation forms on the stone faces. Those droplets do not evaporate back into the air the way surface dew does, because they are already underground, shielded from wind and direct sunlight. Instead, gravity pulls them downward through the gaps between the stones, straight down, directly into the deep root zone, bypassing the top 10 to 15 centimeters of soil, where evaporation would otherwise claim them entirely. A 2018 study published in the journal Agricultural Water Management measured subsurface condensation contribution in rock mulch systems in semi-arid regions and found that during dry summer months, condensation alone contributed between 0.3 and 0.8 millimeters of water per day to the root zone of instrumented plots. That number sounds small until you calculate it across a growing season. Roughly 27 to 72 millimeters of water delivered directly to deep roots from nothing but temperature differential and atmospheric humidity, with zero energy input and zero irrigation infrastructure. The Nabateans were harvesting atmospheric water with rocks 2,000 years before the concept of fog collection was ever written into an engineering textbook. And there is a third function that combines both mechanisms. When you water your tree conventionally, from a hose or a sprinkler, the majority of that water, studies suggest up to 40% in hot, dry conditions, evaporates from the soil surface before it ever reaches root depth. The rock column eliminates that loss for any water that enters through it. Water poured directly into the column travels down through the stone gaps under gravity, protected from surface evaporation for its entire descent, arriving at root level intact. You are not just watering more efficiently, you are changing the architecture of how water moves through your soil. This is the moment in the video where something should shift for you, because if you have been fighting your garden, buying irrigation systems, frost covers, soil moisture meters, and losing that fight, it is not because your garden is difficult. It is because you have been solving a physics problem with products instead of with physics. You are not a consumer of gardening solutions. You are an engineer of living systems, and engineers understand their materials. The question now is how to build it. Building a thermal rock pillar system takes less than 30 minutes per tree, requires no special tools, and the materials cost between $4 and $10, depending on whether you source your stones from a riverbed or a landscaping supplier. Here is exactly how it works. Start with your stone selection. You want dark-colored igneous rock. Basalt is ideal. Granite works well. Dark river gravel is perfectly acceptable. The color matters because of absorption rate, as covered earlier. Avoid light-colored limestone or white decorative gravel. They reflect rather than absorb solar radiation and will underperform significantly. The stones should be irregular in shape rather than perfectly round, because irregular surfaces create more condensation area and leave natural gaps for water movement. Size matters too. Aim for pieces between 3 and 7 centimeters in diameter. Too small and the column compacts, blocking water flow. Too large and you lose condensation surface area. Now the installation. Using a narrow spade or a post hole digger, create holes approximately 30 centimeters deep and 10 centimeters wide, positioned around the drip line of your tree, the outer edge of the canopy, directly above where the feeder roots are most active. For a young fruit tree with a canopy spread of 1 meter, 3 to 4 holes evenly spaced is sufficient. For a mature tree with a 2 to 3 meter spread, use 6 to 8 holes. Pack the dark stones into each hole firmly, bringing them flush with the soil surface. Do not mound them above ground. You want the thermal column to be subsurface, not a surface feature. One important detail that most people miss: orient your holes on the south-facing side of the tree if you are in the northern hemisphere, or the north-facing side in the southern hemisphere. This maximizes solar exposure to the column tops during winter months when the sun angle is low, precisely the season when you need the thermal effect most. The total material cost for a standard fruit tree installation runs between $4 and $10 in dark gravel, purchased once, and the system functions indefinitely with zero maintenance. Compare that to electric root zone heaters at $80 to $200 per season, frost fleece at $15 to $40 per year that degrades and needs replacing, or subsurface drip systems starting at $50 with ongoing parts costs. One installation, no power source, no replacement schedule, no ongoing expense. Just physics working silently underground every single night. Leave the columns in place year-round. In winter, they provide the frost buffer and condensation feeding described earlier. In summer, The same columns deliver irrigation water directly to root depth and reduce surface evaporation around the base of your tree. The system does not have an off-season. The $130 billion gardening industry is not going to make a video about this. They are not going to put dark river gravel on the cover of a gardening magazine or recommend it in a sponsored post. There is nothing to sell. There is no margin. And that is precisely why this knowledge keeps disappearing. Not because it fails, but because it cannot be packaged. What you can do right now is something that costs nothing and takes 30 seconds. If you share this video, you are not helping a channel grow. You are keeping a 2,000-year-old body of knowledge alive for one more person. You are placing it in front of someone who might be watching their trees struggle through every winter, spending money on solutions that treat the symptom while the actual answer was sitting in a riverbed the whole time. Subscribe not because this channel deserves your attention, but because the information that will appear here next, about methods the $130 billion industry has spent decades making you forget, deserves yours. And in the next video, we go underground in a completely different way. There is a fungal network beneath healthy soil that your plants are desperately trying to communicate through. And the single most common gardening product sold in every nursery on Earth is quietly destroying it every time you use it. That video might make you angry. It should.